I started off this project with 8/4 walnut, and for all you non-woodworkers, that just means that the lumber was 2 inches thick to start off with. I wanted the final thickness of the door to be 1 3/4 inches, and that allows for about 1/4 inch of jointing and planing on both sides. When I first got this lumber, I was still actually debating in my head whether I wanted to make the panels on the inside engineered, and that just means gluing up multiple pieces of LVL, basically plywood that has the grain orientation all running in the same direction, or if I wanted to just make them out of solid wood. And I finally decided that I wanted to do them engineered, and that's just because this door was so wide and the middle panels took up a lot of space, and I wanted to avoid the risk of having those middle panels warp and cup. So here I'm just milling down the lumber. I went ahead and laid out all the pieces and tried to pick out what I wanted to be my stiles and what I wanted to be those center panels. Now those center panels end up being resawed, which I'm doing here, and I did most of my resawing actually on the table saw. I did it because for me the speed is just a lot faster than doing it on the bandsaw, and I also was just being quite lazy and I didn't want to switch over my bandsaw blade to a 3/4 inch or a 1/2 inch, which I didn't have. And since my table saw is a 5 horsepower 3-phase, it can go through this stuff like butter, so I decided to saw it all off. And I didn't get it perfect, so I hand planed off any little edges, and then I ran it through the planer and got these thinner panels all roughly the same size. Now this is that LVL that I was talking about, and you can see here it comes in a big board, and what I did was cut down strips, then glued these all together, and this whole process I'm only showing a very small fraction of the amount of glue ups. Just to give you an idea, when this door was done, I had gone through one of those big gallon jugs of glue of Type Bond 2, and it was a lot of glue. So one thing I did was I hand planed all these LVL panels, and then I ran them through the planer again, after which I proceeded to glue up those thinner panels of walnut that I had cut. And the walnut ended up being about 1/4 inch thick. The tricky part about making these was that I knew that it was going to be very difficult to get these edges to completely line up, so I cut them large in anticipation of me having to trim down these panels after the fact, which inevitably I did. As you can see here, each board didn't produce a wide enough panel, so I had to glue up the 2 thinner ones first, and then I would glue them up to the actual mid panel of LVL. Again, I'm only showing a small fraction of what this actually took. All in all, I lost track of the amount of glue ups I did. For a reference edge, I just took some scrap piece of plywood, and you can see I put some tape on there, and I also brad nailed a piece as a reference stop, and that kind of kept the panels from sliding around too much. I also used another trick that I'm not going to take credit for, but I used a lot of salt in my glue ups, and this is a trick I've been using almost on every single glue up because it works awesome. The salt just keeps the panels from sliding around and really helps you get the clamps on without having it move all over the place on you. So this is the bottom panel, which is going to be all solid wood. I did the stiles, solid wood, and I did the top and bottom panel. And as you can see, this was too big to run through the jointer or the planer, and so I'm flattening one side, and then I'm going to run it through the planer and get it all ready to get assembled. Now for me, hand planing is enjoyable, and I actually really like to find an excuse to use my hand plane. I know for some people, they look at it as kind of primitive. For me, I think it's actually, I have a lot more control, and I can see exactly how much material I'm removing, exactly where I'm removing it, and I really like using it. So I did loose tenon construction for all the joinery here. I took a very big end mill bit that I actually got from a CNC, and I tried to make these mortises as deep as I possibly could. I did 2 floating tenons for that bottom bigger panel, and then I only did 1 for the top panel because it was going to be a lot thinner. And as you can see, I'm marking everything with a marking gauge, which is my favorite way to mark out mortises. And then just using that edge guide, cutting on both sides so that spacing is completely equidistant on both edges. To make my loose tenons, I used a round over bit. I just ran it on all 4 sides of the board, and then I chopped these into slightly bigger floating tenons than I needed. I ended up having to cut these down a little bit later. I gave everything a nice test fit, and here you can see I'm running my glued up panels, the engineered panels, through the planer. I think it was 7 in total that I had to make for this project. So it was 9 panels in total and 7 engineered ones. And the 7 engineered panels definitely took the longest time out of this whole process. So here I'm flush cutting these panels because the top and the bottom weren't going to be the same. So I picked the shortest sides, and this might be kind of hard to explain, but if you saw it, you would understand. They basically didn't form a right angle. So I ran everything through a flush trim bit. Then I ran the other side through the table saw, and that way everything was nice and square. I used my crosscut sled to get a square edge on one side, and then I used a stop block so that I could get these panels all the same width. You can see that it's basically like a walnut LVL sandwich. And I'm not quite sure what, I think my reasoning at first was I was going to add in a piece of wood and these were all going to interlock in together, but that didn't quite work out. So what I ended up doing was adding a piece of scrap or a piece of plywood in between these, and then I ran these through the table saw once again and made a dado in the middle. I essentially had floating splines in the middle of all these panels. That was primarily to help with alignment, because I knew once they were all together, it was going to be quite a challenge to keep everything aligned. I think if I were to do this again, I would probably make the LVL panels quite a bit bigger and try to get them to match the size of the walnut panels. And even if the alignment wasn't perfect, I would run it through the jointer, and then I would run the other side through the table saw. I think my worry was that they were going to be so all over the place, and if that LVL panel stuck out too much, then I was going to get grain that was kind of diagonal looking, or not really quite sure what. Or I think my thought process initially was that I was going to use that gap as the actual dado to interlock them, but it ended up just not being exactly how I thought it would be. So this project made a lot of dust. I think I collected 2 giant trash bags of dust from my dust collector from all the milling and probably the thousands of cuts I had to make on the table saw. And here I'm making these dados and running it on one side and then flipping it and running it through the other side so that I make sure that that dado is exactly in the middle of that panel. And there you saw me running panels probably the way you shouldn't, but I felt comfortable enough on these that it wasn't going to be an issue. But if you're looking for the ideal safety video, this is probably not the video you should be following for any sort of safety advice. I also marked all these panels to make sure that they stayed in the arrangement that I liked, because I was pretty particular about how I organized the grain. And you can see these are the first two that I glued up, and I tried to use cauls and lots of clamps to keep everything straight and aligned and as flat as I possibly could, because the biggest worry I had was that there was going to be cupping that was going to get pronounced over the length of 7 panels. Luckily, this whole glue up came out pretty flat. I was actually quite relieved when it was all done, because going into any project, that's always the biggest worry, is that you're going to get this thing that's cupped a ½ an inch, and maybe you don't have a ½ an inch of material to remove. So what do you do then? I used a lot of glue and I used a lot of cauls and clamps to try to keep these things as straight as I possibly could. And as you can see, I'm not as refined as some of these other YouTubers who have those fancy silicone brushes. I finally actually did get one with an epoxy kit I had, and I've been trying to use that to keep the glue off my fingers, but inevitably I just end up spreading the glue with my fingers. And here you can see that gluing up 7 of these things. So I glued them up one and one, and then I glued up these 2 big sections together. This was an awkward task. There I had a little bit of nib of wood that was keeping it from coming together. I think after struggling for about 20 minutes or so, I finally got it together, and I'm throwing some cauls on in the middle and just making sure that it is as flat as I can possibly get it. And yeah, I was pretty happy with this. Now, I had already cut these panels to width, but I had still kept them long because I knew once I had glued them all up, I was still going to have to square all 4 edges all over again, because no matter how close you get it, it seems like you can never get those edges to perfectly line up. I clamped a piece of plywood, and I'm just running my circular saw. I'm not that fancy to have a track saw yet. And then what I also did too, because I wasn't sure if I was shaky with my circular saw, I made sure to run my flush trim bit. That way I get a perfectly square edge. So here I'm cutting the window opening with the router, making more and more of a mess. The amount of dust that this project produced was kind of ridiculous. And again, using the hand plane just to get rid of all that excess glue, any high spots. And then I came in with the chisel to give myself some nice square edges. Now this was the side that the frame was going to go on, so the routing and even this chisel work didn't need to be perfect because this was all going to get covered up by that frame, but I did my best to give it a nice square edge. So now time for the glue up. So to hold the center panel between the 2 styles of the door, what I did was I ran a large router groove and I used another spline. And that was to ensure that I got that alignment just right and to add a bit of strength as well. There, I'm just ripping my splines on the table saw, and I'm taking off any of the sharp edges just to make sure those floating tenons go in nice and smooth. I always like to have my tenons fit tight, but I've realized that on these big glue ups, if everything fits really tight, it becomes very difficult to get the whole project to close up correctly. So now I try to go for a medium tight fit, and then when everything is together, it forms a tight fit. So I go for medium tight rather than tight. I've definitely been in this situation where it's been too tight and you're trying to clamp it and the thing just does not want to come together. And this glue up was stressful because it was really hot that day and this thing is heavy and awkward. I didn't have a tabletop surface big enough, so I had to do this on the floor. So I was kind of running from one clamp to another, checking to make sure it stayed square, to make sure it stayed flat. Then I would go throw on another clamp, then a caul. At the end of this whole procedure, I was actually really happy with how this came out. It almost had no bow in it at all, or nothing that I had to really remove. Obviously there was glue squeeze out and all that, but in terms of getting, I think this door was 42.5 inches wide by 79 inches tall, so I was very excited that this came together flat. Also, I did this glue up in 2 pieces. I glued that left stile on first, and I made sure that that set up, and I only left it on for about 4 hours or so, and after that had set up, then I came back through and added that right stile. I figured if I had tried to do everything all at once, there was a bigger chance that it was not going to come together square, or it was going to leave some sort of gaps. And here I made a little jig to do those, I don't even know what you call them, they're little router grooves to accentuate the panels. And I used a little V-bit, and I set this router jig up where it's supposed to reference a right angle, but from my experience, I still had to make sure that it didn't drift, because just even a 1/2 millimeter of that being shifted and your whole line is going to be off of being perfectly square. So I clamp these guides on every single time, and I try to find that glue line. And here you can see this glue line did not come together, but luckily I was able to fix this by routing out a 3/8 inch groove and then filling it with a piece of walnut and then just planing it flat. After I ran the V-bit through this part, it was essentially invisible, and I was pretty happy that I was able to hide this mistake. That was about the only, this actually happened on both sides, and there was about a 1/16 of an inch gap that didn't come together. And so for as many cuts and glue ups as this project involved, I was actually not that dissatisfied with that result. So here I'm just double checking to make sure that these lines all stay parallel to each other and that nothing goes out of square. I did this for both sides of the door, and I checked for square, and then I also double measured and made sure that those lines were running parallel to each other. After this door was glued together, one of the hardest things about this project became moving this thing around and flipping it without scratching it. So I started laying down tons of blankets and cardboard and just whatever I could find to avoid scratching it, which actually this first time that I flipped it, I scratched it pretty badly. And that's just because the weight of this and any contact with corners is just a bad recipe for disaster. Here I'm making the handle, and to keep these square, what I did was brad nailed a piece of scrap plywood. Then I found the center, and I marked a center line so that I could get a hole in the topmost part of this little dowel. I made a little jig so that this would hold this piece nice and flat, and then on the drill press I just used this hole saw to cut through. Then I drilled a pilot center hole because I was going to use an auger bit, and that auger bit I find is too aggressive when that screw catches, so I wanted to actually clear out that part so that it would disengage that leading screw. So here's the brass caps that I'm going to be putting on. I had to cut the ends of that walnut down, and I did it on the table saw, just spinning it around and then trimming it up with the chisel, and I got a nice tight fit. I did the same thing for long piece. I brad nailed little pieces of scrap, and then I built this little jig to help me get the center holes drilled directly in the center. Took this little jig over to the drill press, marked the center, drilled through it, and then I was going to hand drill this on the table because I thought it was going to be way too awkward to try to get this long thing on my drill press. And I actually drilled these out by hand with the auger bit, and for me, I actually like using the hand drill. I feel like if I'm worried about control and just getting a nice clean hole, I do a lot better with the hand drill. Then I did a little test fit and put some glue on and threw some clamps on. I tested these for square as well, which I don't show here, and for these end caps I used some epoxy. Then I cleaned up all the glue and squeeze out and all the mill marks that were on that large dowel, and I did the majority of it with a card scraper because I found it to be a lot faster than using just sandpaper. So for the window, I used just standard window caulk, dark, and my window fit was a little tighter than I wanted. And for this frame, I probably went a little bit overkill. I did caulk, glue, and then I used these little miter clamps, which I absolutely love. They do leave a little mark, but they're great for keeping your miters nice and tight. And I used brad nails instead of clamps to keep that frame nice and tight. For the finish, I finished with Rubio Monocoat, and despite the name Monocoat, I'm not really satisfied with one coat, so I actually do 2 coats of Rubio Monocoat, and then I actually kind of buff it out with a really fine Scotch-Brite pad, and then I do another coat or 2 or 3 of linseed oil, of boiled linseed oil. Hey, let me know what you guys thought of that video. If you love it, if you hate it, if you have any suggestions, leave all the love, the hate, the comments below. It's okay, I have a thick skin, but really tell me what you guys thought, if you would do anything different. I was really pleased with the way that this project came out. Of course, in every project there's something to learn, and I hope that you guys learned something from this. I sure did. And if you have any questions, comments, leave them down below, and I will be sure to answer them. Thanks, and see you on the next one.